may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
All right, I'm very excited to bring y'all this video, my dudes, because I think there is so much value to be had in this offense. And now, while, yeah, there are definitely players being overvalued, and we're going to get to just them, but I think almost every single player on this team is incorrectly valued, whether they are overvalued, undervalued. We are going to get to that with an in-depth breakdown of each guy. But before we do that, let's just give a big shout out to the city of Tampa. We are actually moving the Flock studio there in about a month. I can't wait for y'all to see the new studio. I can't be more excited about it. But yeah, go down there, drop that like, because we recently passed 24,000 subscribers with all the support y'all have showed on these videos by dropping those likes, leaving those comments. And also, I want to give a big shout out to everybody supporting the show on Patreon, because that's the reason why we get to move into a new studio where the background is going to be completely upgraded while our entire setup is going to be upgraded. We had over 100 people join the flock over there on Patreon this past month, which is obviously ridiculous. So I just want to give everybody a massive, massive thank you over there. And I promise you, the draft guide is on the way. The draft guide is actually why I decided to make this video, because researching our first wide receiver here, Mike Evans, I mean, my opinion completely changed. Okay, so with Mike Evans, I will be the first person to admit I am very biased with Evans. So y'all know I started playing Dynasty Fantasy Football, and it really consumed my life back in 2014. That was my first year in it. No, this isn't a Dynasty video, but just giving you some background here with why I'm so biased with Mike Evans. In that 2014 wide receiver draft class, I fell in love with. I mean, that's why we have Odell Beckham Jr. and his Giants jersey behind us. That's why we have Sammy Watkins and his Bills jersey behind us, because that was a magical draft class with these prospects. You had Odell, Sammy Watkins, Allen Robinson, you had Brandon Cooks, you had so many players, and we can just continue to go down that list. But Mike Evans was a part of that, so he'll always have a special place in my heart. So I naturally thought we were probably going to be a little bit higher than consensus on Mike Evans this upcoming year. I mean, in mock drafts, I haven't really been avoiding him. I thought that he was a decent value. And that's because this past year, Mike Evans was decent in fantasy. I mean, he's been one of the most consistent fantasy producers since coming into the NFL in 2014. I mean, someone that's literally every single season posting over 16 points per game. He is someone that has been the definition of consistent. Now, I will say, going to be 28 years old, but with Mike Evans, you don't really have to worry about him aging poorly, because he's a wide receiver that mainly wins at the catch point. He's 6'5", 231 pounds. I mean, he wins at the catch point. He has great hands, and he's not a burner. He's not a Brandon Cooks. He's not a T.Y. Hilton. So you're not going to be seeing that speed fall off and then the play fall off for Mike Evans. But here with Mike Evans, right now, going as the wide receiver 14 in fantasy drafts, this is a horrendous price. He is going ahead of Robert Woods, Amari Cooper, Julio Jones, and Chris Godwin. And I'll be the first one to admit, I mean, whenever I went through a couple months ago and I made the initial rankings for the 2021 season, I had Mike Evans in the same range. I mean, we looked at that ADP. I went, you know what? That's about fair with what we've had from Mike Evans over the past 5 years, what we had with him and Tom Brady this last year winning the Super Bowl. Because not only did they win the Super Bowl, which obviously gives everybody some euphoria with this overall offense, but Mike Evans was decent in fantasy in 2020. I mean, he actually finishes as the wide receiver 16 in points per game. He finishes with 15.53 points per game, which, yes, is lower than we have seen from Mike Evans in a very long time. I mean, if you go back to 2019, he averaged almost 18 points a game. The same thing in 2018. But we know that with Jameis Winston. I mean, Jameis Winston actually led the NFL in passing back in 2019. That's going to be a DGAF quarterback that you're just seeing the passing volume go through the roof because of style of play. And while it may be great for fantasy and great for the receiving options, it's not necessarily going to be good for an NFL team. But that put Mike Evans in a range where you could confidently bet that he was going to be a wide receiver 1. And myself and a lot of other people were a little bit worried with what this change to Tom Brady was going to look like for both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. But Mike Evans still maintained that mark as a wide receiver 2 in fantasy. But the problem was how Mike Evans got here. So we know that when you chase time and time and time again in fantasy is you want to go through and chase the volume. You want to chase receiving yards a game. You want to, most importantly, chase targets a game for these wide receivers, because that is the most correlated thing that we have found from season to season. Well, here with Mike Evans, the main problem was we actually see him from 2018 at 95 receiving yards a game, going down to 90 in 2019, plummeting in 2020 down to 62 receiving yards a game. Now, this is massive, and you see the same thing with targets here, where in 2018, he averages over 8.5 targets a game. In 2019, he has over 9 targets a game. And in 2020, he is down to 6.8. So you see a massive fall off in both the volume and the efficiency with the receiving yards a game for Mike Evans. Now, what saves him in fantasy is Mike Evans actually averaged 0.8 touchdowns per game, which is a mark. While, yeah, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be rolling your eyes at it because we had already previously stated that Mike Evans is 6'5", 231 pounds. If anybody's going to have a high touchdown potential, it's Mike Evans. But the problem here is that's going to be very volatile season to season. And this is the highest mark that Mike Evans has seen over the past 3 years. We go back to 2018. There he averaged 0.5 receiving touchdowns a game. 2019, he was at 0.6. So this jump up to 0.8 is not sustainable. What you need to chase is you need to chase this volume, which saw a massive dip for Mike Evans, and that should lower his fantasy value in my opinion. Not to mention that we also had Chris Godwin injured for a decent amount of games this past year, which in theory should have made it where Mike Evans became the alpha wide receiver on this offense. Well, even with that happening, he still could not hit 7 targets a game. And for that reason, I mean, from our initial set of rankings that we were going to have for the 2021 season, Mike Evans possibly has been one of the largest fallers as we do more research, understanding where his fantasy production is coming from, understanding what is predictable season to season. I mean, I think there's no reason for him to go ahead of Robert Woods, Amari Cooper, Julio Jones, or Chris Godwin. I love Mike Evans, but I'm unsure if I'm going to own him in a single league. Now, a wide receiver on the complete opposite side of this spectrum, Chris Godwin, someone that I naturally thought we were going to be lower on than consensus. Now, it's embarrassing to admit this, but anybody who's been watching the channel since 2019 remembers that in 2019, Chris Godwin, his blow-up season, where he was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy, where he comes out and just smashes the definition of a league winner. I was coming out here and I was saying nobody is overvalued more in fantasy than Chris Godwin. And I could not have been more wrong. I mean, that was embarrassing. And of course, I'm going to be bringing that up until the end of time because it was just like our Juju Smith-Schuster call from last year. Not only were we dead wrong, but we were aggressive with that take. I mean, it was something I almost said every single video we referenced. So you would think that I have some negative bias going into Chris Godwin's evaluation. But here we are looking at the exact opposite of what we had with Mike Evans. Right here, Chris Godwin is actually going as the wide receiver 18. He's going behind that same group of wide receivers that we discussed in Mike Evans, Robert Woods, Julio Jones, and Amari Cooper. And I think there's no reason for this because we go through and while, yes, Chris Godwin had a very disappointing season on the whole, mainly because, I mean, he suffered those injuries at the beginning of the season. We know that's going to hinder him even when he was playing. He was in and out of the lineup. But Chris Godwin was able to maintain a relatively high amount of targets per game this past year. I mean, Chris Godwin did hit 7 targets a game. He hit 70 receiving yards a game. Now, no, he was not productive like Mike Evans in the touchdown category. But what was impressive is Mike Evans had an unsustainable 0.81 touchdown per game mark, where Chris Godwin, down there at a range where you can reasonably project him season to season, where he was a little bit under 0.6. He actually outproduced Mike Evans this past year. And we know that Chris Godwin, 25 years old, this is someone going into his prime. This is someone that you're expecting, I don't want to say to get better, but definitely you don't have to consider him getting worse at all. So you're looking at Chris Godwin, a wide receiver that suffered from injuries last year, a wide receiver that averaged less receiving touchdowns, even though we know what's more predictive on receiving touchdowns rather than past performances is actually usage in the offense. So that's really just unlucky for Chris Godwin, to be completely honest. Yet at the same time, he finishes ahead of Mike Evans in points per game. Now, barely, but it's still notable that Chris Godwin finishes as the wide receiver 15 in fantasy. And now he is going consistently behind Mike Evans. I mean, I rarely ever see a draft where Chris Godwin's drafted ahead of Mike Evans. And I think he should be ranked multiple spots ahead. I mean, we just completely flipped the 2 wide receivers in our rankings that will be posted over there on Patreon in less than a month now. But I mean, Chris Godwin, someone I thought we were going to be lower on compared to consensus, someone that I have been horribly wrong on in the past. I think that he's actually a great value in fantasy right now. Now, going to some of the other pieces in this offense, of course, we are going to be having to talk about Antonio Brown. Now, Antonio Brown, I don't say the hardest player to evaluate in fantasy because when he's going as the wide receiver 45, I mean, you're not investing that much into that pick. I mean, if you're taking him behind a Jarvis Landry, a Michael Pittman, a Jalen Waddle, you're very rarely ever going to be looking back 6 months from that draft and going, oh my God, I lost this year because I decided to draft Antonio Brown. But anyway, we go through and we look at Antonio Brown this past season. And yes, he was disappointing. I mean, obviously, he was not Antonio Brown with what he was in Pittsburgh. But we have to know, Antonio Brown, 32 years old. This is when you expect that fall off from even the top wide receivers in the NFL. But with Antonio Brown, I really want to point out that this was a wide receiver that was out of football. And he comes back and he gets a role on this team day one. I mean, he is day one playing 70% of the snaps on this offense. Now, of course, you're going to expect Antonio Brown, someone who was out of the game for so long, he's not going to be just fine-tuned. He's not going to be ready to be peak Antonio Brown as he once was. It's going to take him a little bit of time to get ramped up. He's going to have to get into football shape. He's going to have to make sure that everything's going on correctly. And I understand he's, of course, training on the side, but I think it's very different of going through a week-to-week schedule during the NFL season, staying on top of your craft versus training with your trainer on the side, even with Antonio Brown supposedly having a fantastic work ethic. Well, what I want to do is let's look after the bye week for Antonio Brown. And after the bye week, including the playoffs, Antonio Brown played 7 games. So I think that's a decent sample. I think that's a sample that we can fairly evaluate. And in those 7 games, Antonio Brown managed to score 108.6 fantasy points. Now, you do some quick math, and that's good for 15.5 points per game this past year. And we take a step back, we go, okay, if he would have scored 15.5 fantasy points the entire season, where would have that put him in fantasy football ranks? Well, then he would have been the wide receiver 16 in fantasy football on a points per game basis. Now, this is notable because Antonio Brown, we have seen him be the wide receiver 1 overall in fantasy season after season after season after season. We know the talent's there. What you're just having to find is you're just having to find Antonio Brown coming back and being able to just get a small piece of what he once was. And then combining that with Hall of Fame quarterback, the greatest quarterback of all time in Tom Brady, and then hoping that this is a guy that can be a low-end wide receiver 2 in fantasy. Because if you draft Antonio Brown as the wide receiver 45 and he's a low-end wide receiver 2, I mean, that's a fantastic draft pick. That's arguably a league-winning draft pick. So Antonio Brown, someone that I have not been drafting a lot as of late, but I think this is honestly something we have to change. I think that we were completely wrong with this offense. I think ADP is so skewed here where Mike Evans going way too high, Chris Godwin going too low, and Antonio Brown possibly going too low as well. And I hate to say this because I don't like Chris Godwin. I don't like Antonio Brown, but the numbers don't lie here. So I think we just have to go with the numbers. And lastly, let's talk about my man, Tom Brady. So yes, we already admitted Tom Brady, the best quarterback to ever play the game. Maybe you can make an argument with how hard it is to actually win a Super Bowl where you have to go through and you can't lose a single game in a postseason. Now, I know a lot of people are going to hate me saying this, but you can make the argument Tom Brady, the best athlete of all time. But regardless, let's put all that aside because obviously that means nothing for fantasy football this upcoming season. I just have to get that disclaimer out here because be ready for me to talk bad about Tom Brady. But Tom Brady right now in fantasy drafts is going as the quarterback 8. Now, I think this is maybe just casual drafters coming in and seeing the name Tom Brady and going, oh my God, Tom Brady, he just won the Super Bowl. Let's draft him at quarterback 8 and not really understanding what they're doing because this is a very, very, very bad draft pick where there is literally no upside to be had here with Tom Brady at the quarterback 8 price. Now, let me explain myself in this. Because Tom Brady, currently 44 years old, so nobody's going to sit here and argue that Tom Brady is getting better than what he was last year. I think it's only on the decline for Tom Brady. The question is, how much is that decline going to be? But regardless, let's assume that he doesn't decline at all. Let's assume that Tom Brady is the same quarterback that he was last year. He is still going ahead of Jalen Hurts, Aaron Rodgers, Matthew Stafford, and Ryan Tannehill. And now the problem with Tom Brady, and this is sad to say, but fantasy football is not real football. I mean, you are not constructing a real team here. What you have to understand is you have to understand the importance of rushing at the quarterback position for someone to return value on where they're drafted. Because last season, Tom Brady had a fantastic year. Obviously, he won Super Bowl MVP. This is someone that you're not going to have me tell you that he had a great year last year. But he also was third in the NFL in overall passing yards. He was also tied for second in the NFL in passing touchdowns. So I think Tom Brady, I don't want to say hit his ceiling last year, but he was damn right there. I mean, with Tom Brady, he's third in both main categories. What else can you ask for at this point? Now, acknowledging the fact that Tom Brady was, if not one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL last season, what did that give him in fantasy football? A fake game that we play on top of a real game. Because that's what matters here. We're not ranking players if we are drafting a team for real life. No, we are trying to score these fake points. And here, Tom Brady, with our fake little game, was 10th in points per game, with him averaging both a top 3 number in passing yards as well as passing touchdowns. And he was 10th in points per game. So that is telling me that Tom Brady, because he is someone that literally is never going to pick up anything on the ground, has a ceiling to be anywhere from the quarterback 9, 10, 11, 12 range to just anything below that. I mean, there's no reason to expect Tom Brady can finish higher than this mark. And he is currently being drafted at quarterback 8. So, well, yeah, I mean, obviously, Jalen Hurts is a way worse real life quarterback. I mean, when we're playing a fantasy football game, a fake game, take the player that's going to be scoring the points. Take the player that's going to be picking up rushing yards and rushing touchdowns to go along with his passing statistics. But thank you, my dudes. I really hope y'all enjoyed this video. Of course, go down there, drop that like, leave that comment, subscribe to the channel. It helps us out a ton, and I'll see y'all with the video tomorrow. I want to give a big thank you for everyone joining the flock over there on Patreon. In Castro, Brian, Mike, Jay, Samuel, Billy, Rocky, Bailey, Zachary, and Andrew. Thank you, my dudes.